My name is Scott Barrett, and I'm the Associate Dean for External Affairs at the Maxwell School, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's forum. This is the latest in a series of conversations with Maxwell faculty members who are leading experts nationally and internationally on important topics of the day. We'll be recording this event and we'll post the recording on the Maxwell YouTube channel so that Maxwell alumni and friends who could not join us this afternoon can watch it as well. Later in the program, you will have the opportunity to ask questions. When we get to that portion of the program, please raise your virtual hand using the raise hand button at the bottom of the participant list, which is an icon at the bottom of your screen. You can access it by clicking that icon and you can raise your hand and leave it raised and we'll call on you. Or you can type your question in the chat box using the chat icon at the bottom of the screen and we will ask your question for you. We are delighted to have Professor Len Lopoo with us today, Professor of Public Administration and International Affairs. Professor Lopoo is the Maxwell Advisory Board Professor of Public Policy, Director of the Maxwell Center for Policy Research, or CPR as we call it, and co-founder and director of the Maxwell X Lab. His research is interdisciplinary with interests primarily involving the family, fertility, marriage, maternal employment, and the social welfare policies designed to assist low-income populations. Professor Lopoo has published in a number of journals, including Demography, Journal of Health Economics, Journal of Human Resources, Journal of Marriage and the Family, Journal of Policy Analysis and Management, and the Journal of Public Economics, among many others. He's received funding from a number of federal agencies, including the Kennedy Shriver National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, the National Institute on Aging, the Pew Charitable Trusts, the Smith Richardson Foundation, the United States Department of Agriculture, and the Ralph C. Wilson Jr. Foundation, and the Allen Family Foundation. Professor Lopoo is a top teacher in the Maxwell School, and he is the recipient of numerous awards for his research and his teaching, including the Burkhead Teaching Excellence Award, which he won twice, a Syracuse University Excellence in Graduate Education Faculty Recognition Award, a Meredith Professor Recognition Award, and he received the Daniel Patrick Moynihan Prize. Professor Lopoo was recently inducted just last year as a Fellow of the National Academy of Public Administration. We're thrilled to have him join us today and to talk to us about his work. Professor Lopoo, please take it from here.
Great, thank you, Scott. I appreciate being invited to spend some time with some of our alums and to talk about the Maxwell X Lab. Really, our goal here is to really kind of fulfill the mission of the Maxwell School. We do a lot of work where we try to connect kind of things that we've learned through scholarship and place some of those ideas in communities where they can do a lot of good. So I appreciate the chance to talk a bit about the lab today. So can we go to the next slide? So it is a bit of an introduction to the lab. We're not so new anymore. We started in 2017, and really our goal, as I said, is to make connections between what we are all about here in the Maxwell School and at Syracuse University, and to really work with public sector, nonprofit agencies to find out what actually works and to create some evidence to say things with conviction and with certainty, so that we can do things and make things better. So that's really what the lab is all about. If I could, I'd like to maybe motivate some of my conversation this afternoon by talking about a topic I think that's on all of our minds right now, and that is the COVID-19 pandemic. And I really want to contrast kind of two groups or two issues that have come up in this pandemic. I think, of course, initially we were all concerned and are concerned about our health and health issues, and public health officials have sort of had a lot to say and contribute there. But I think very quickly we realized that the pandemic also has a huge economic impact, and that we can't just think about the health consequences. We also want to think a lot about the economic consequences of the pandemic. And what's really important from the perspective of the X Lab is the innovations that have occurred in both areas. And I think by contrasting the two, you can see that while we are trying to innovate in both of these spaces, both in the public health as well as in the economic or social sphere, one group has a very specific approach to determining whether those innovations work, and the other group does not. And that group where there is so much of what I would call a void is where the X Lab and it hopes to step in and has done a lot of work. So to say a little bit more about that, I guess, could we go to the next slide, please? I just want to start maybe with this public health part and lay a couple of pieces of information out that I think most of us are quite familiar with. Earlier this year, in March, around the middle of March, some French researchers circulated a study and they suggested that hydroxychloroquine was an effective treatment for COVID-19. Almost immediately, that study was picked up by President Trump, and during a press conference or a series of press conferences, he talked a lot about that particular study and that this was a potential treatment. Now, I don't really want to get into the sort of political side of this at all. What I really want to emphasize is that political actors are putting pressure on both groups, the public health side as well as the economic side. And I think the responses have been dramatically different. And you can see that, you could have seen that in that initial press conference where Dr. Fauci, after the president spoke about this being a game changer, very, I think, carefully said, not so fast, we're not quite sure yet. We have not undergone any medical trials yet, and we want to make sure that we do that. A few days after that initial press conference, the Director General of the World Health Organization said something quite similar. Said, before we go forward with any medications, we really need to test these. We really need to run these through kind of the scientific process before we can say anything, and that we may do more harm than good if we don't. And within a month, the NIH, after convening a panel of public health experts, actually issued a report that said, no drug should be administered in response to the pandemic unless it's part of a medical trial. And the medical trial is really the part I want to emphasize. It's not that we shouldn't innovate. It's not that we shouldn't try, but that we shouldn't do anything without the scientific side of this. And that is to really do a rigorous evaluation. Now, I want to contrast that with what's happened on the other side, this economic dimension, where a couple of the interventions that were tried were a stimulus check. I think we're all very familiar with that, of $1,200, as well as some unemployment benefits. There's been a lot of controversy recently about the $600 unemployment assistance, and whether that was actually, one side was saying that was so much money that individuals were not looking for employment because it was more profitable for them not to work, and the other side saying the only thing keeping our economy floating is this aid. Now, interesting to me, because I've been asked a lot about this, my answer is I don't know what works. I don't know how effective it was, and the reason, unlike some of the medical side where they're actually doing the trials and they won't go forward until we know what works and what doesn't work, here we didn't do any of that. No one today can tell you with any accuracy at all whether the $600 is the right amount, if it's too much, if it's not enough. And I think that's led to a lot of the complications that we're seeing in the political sphere. This is very, very common in public administration and is very different from public health. In public health, the doctors say, we're not going forward until we know what works. And we understand that this is difficult, but we cannot put our stamp of approval on anything until we've tried this. On the other side of the sphere, in the economy and social welfare policy and public administration, we repeatedly try things and do things with absolutely no interest at all in trying to determine whether this works. So that's really what the X Lab is about. We are interested in trying to figure out if we're going to innovate, if we're going to try a new program, or if we're going to send a stimulus check to folks. We want to know, did it help? Did it hurt? Are you more likely to work? Are you less likely to work? That really is the goal of the Maxwell X Lab. So to say a little bit more now about the X Lab specifically, if we could go to the next slide. There's really kind of four things that I think about when we discuss the X Lab. The first is this notion that we're going to run, what would this is my second point here, what the public health officials would call the medical trial. In social science, we call these randomized control trials or field experiments. So this exact same notion, and I'll say more about what that literally is. So it's often the case that we'll work with a public agency and they'll say, hey, we've got a great idea, but we don't know if it's going to work or not. Can you help us figure that out? We say, yes, we can run, again, what would be comparable to a medical trial in this particular area, and we'll be able to figure out if it works or not. There are many times when we work with public, excuse me, people in the public sector where they don't actually have an idea for what they might try to improve a problem. So in that case, we'll often use behavioral science. Behavioral science, again, I'll say a bit more about, is basically this notion that we can use that some of the insights from psychology, really. Some folks call this behavioral economics, but what it basically means is that people don't actually operate as rationally or in as straightforward a manner as we often think they do when we're teaching classes on this in the Maxwell School, for example. And that as humans, we all kind of have a few idiosyncratic behaviors and that we should be aware of them. And that can be very limiting in what we're trying to do when we're assisting. As I've said a bunch of times already, we partner often with nonprofits, foundations, local and state governments. That's really where we spend all of our time. And then the nice thing about the X Lab is we have this expertise, we work with community partners, and then we have this deep bench of scholars here that we use. So if this is an environmental issue, we can bring in folks who specialize in environment. If this is an issue with taxes, we can talk to those folks around here who specialize in tax. We have this great deep bench of scholars here, many of whom have been involved in a large number of our projects, and I'll say more about that in just a moment. And I'll mention some of the scholars that we're working with here at the Maxwell School. So it really is this nice combination of scholarship with individuals in the community trying to do things productively in a good way and to try to measure how effective these things are. So behavioral science, just a word or two about this. Again, goes under lots of different names. Behavioral economics is frequently used to describe this. A psychologist would tell you, why are you putting fancy names on all this? This is just, psychology. So I'm highlighting one particular study, I think, to just point out the notion of what we have learned over the last few decades about how important it is to think about people's behaviors as opposed to what we expect. So this is a study, it's kind of a classic example now of patterns of probation from judges and how the likelihood of being granted parole changes throughout the course of the day. Now again, an economist or a social scientist would say, every judge will simply look at the merits of the case and you will evaluate them fairly based on the law, and every individual under a particular circumstance will get the same decision. This study shows that that's actually not the case at all, that over the course of the day, if you compare individuals who've committed the same crime who are very, very similar in every other way, their likelihood of being granted parole changes dramatically depending on when it happens. And in fact, if I'm going up for parole, I want to be the first one up, or I want to be the one right after lunch. What this suggests is if your case comes up right before lunch or right before the break for the end of the day, your chances of getting granted parole go down dramatically. And this is important, right? This is the way humans behave. We have real issues that we think about and that affect us. So we take all the insights that we're learning from a lot of the research on behavioral science and we apply them. This is kind of one of the things we bring to the table. The second thing, if we could go to the next slide, is I mentioned this, the medical trial. As many of you may be familiar with the notion of a medical trial or a randomized controlled trial in a social science setting. The basic innovation here is you take all people who might be eligible for a program, and instead of letting people pick whether they want to receive the program or not, you randomly assign whether they're going to get the intervention or not. And by randomly assigning, what you're basically doing is you're creating a natural comparison so that those who receive the intervention And those who did not receive the intervention, you can compare some outcome. Are they more likely to be working? Are they more likely to turn in their tax forms on time? Whatever the outcome might be, we can compare the two groups, and if we see that there is a big difference, then we will know that the reason that there is a difference is because of the intervention either we created at the X Lab or that our partner created and that we're testing for them. So that's really a lot of what we're doing. And by the way, this is what Dr. Fauci is talking about when he says medical trial. Randomly give some the drug, randomly give some not the drug. Let's wait a little while and let's see, are you returning to health? Are you becoming sicker? That's exactly what happens in these medical trials, and that's exactly what we do. What I will tell you is, and the nice thing about the X Lab is our interventions are much more rapid. So we don't have to wait 6 months, 8 months, 10 months. Most of our studies are done within 2 to 3 months, depending on the size of the program that we're working with. So if I could go to the next slide, but I want to just, I think it might be helpful to hear a little bit about some of the interventions that we have done over the last 3.5 years. The first one listed here, this is actually a photograph from the local paper here in Syracuse, where my co-founder, Joe Boskovsky, is on the right of the screen, and the mayor of Syracuse, Ben Walsh, who is also a Maxwell grad, is on the left side, at least as I'm viewing the figure. And this was an intervention where we tried to improve property tax collections in the city of Syracuse. And we did a very simple intervention where we just tried to communicate better. And I'm happy to talk about how we do a lot of these things in the Q&A. But very simple. I think it cost about $5,000 for us to create this intervention. We left it with the city, and within 4 months, the city had recovered $1.5 million of lost revenue, or revenue that they would not have received in the absence of our intervention. And you might ask, how do we know that? Well, we know that because we did this with a randomized controlled trial. We compared the tax payment rates for the group that didn't get our intervention to the tax payment rates of the groups that did. And the only difference between the two groups was that one group received our intervention. I should say within 2 days, we were getting calls from the city saying, this is working, this is working. So before we'd ever looked at any of the data, we knew it was working because their call center was becoming overwhelmed by the number of people who were saying, I need to pay my taxes, I now realize. I want to emphasize before we move on, I think something that's very, very important. One is we often assume that the reason that people don't do something is the most straightforward or the first idea, right? The reason people aren't paying their taxes is because they can't. That's actually not usually the case. There are certainly a lot of people who don't pay their taxes in the city of Syracuse because they can't. But there is a huge number of people who don't pay their taxes because it's being communicated very, very poorly to them, and they don't understand what's happened, what are the implications, and what their deadlines are. So we just try to clean a lot of that up for them, and it has been extraordinarily successful. The next example is a similar project, something we did in Buffalo. The screen right now is showing you the letter, that's an actual bill that they have for their water collections in Buffalo, New York. We have a couple of ideas that we use, and one of those is that you have a sentence, maybe two, to convey the idea to the individual you're mailing this to. If they don't understand within a sentence what this is about, this isn't going anywhere. And when we looked at the original bill, we recognized they have no idea what this is. Is this a bill? We don't know if it's a bill. We don't know where they should pay. We don't know how they should pay. This is going to be a problem. So we rewrote the bill. It was as simple as that. So if we could go to the next slide, this is what the new bill looks like. Now you might say, this is pretty obvious. Yeah, a lot of this is pretty obvious stuff. What actually you would be surprised. I mean, some of you will probably work in the field of public administration. There are a lot of things that are really low-hanging fruit that the X Lab capitalizes on. One of the things we did was we put up there at the very top, this is a bill. Pay your bill. This is how you pay your bill. Instead of putting a URL that takes them on a wild goose chase for how they're actually going to pay for their bill, we actually say, this is the link. If you type this link into your browser, it will take you directly to your bill. Collections went up there by $255,000. I think it was a 2-month trial, right? So you start to scale these things out. Oh, by the way, that cost $7,000 for us to do. The $1.5 million for the city of Syracuse, $5 million, right? So the ROI on these things is remarkable. And you might say, well, you're just changing the bills. Yeah, we're just changing the bills. A lot of what we're doing also is we're using language. There's ways to couch things that can actually, we have learned just by altering language in a lot of our experiments can have dramatic effects on whether people respond positively, negatively, or not at all. The next example, I've got just 4. So this is our third. This is one where we partnered with one of my colleagues here at the Maxwell School, Colleen Heflin. And here we were working with a group in Hennepin County, Minnesota, where a lot of individuals on the SNAP program, the SNAP provides food benefits. It's frequently, was formerly called food stamps. And in order to remain on the program, you have to become recertified. So every so often they need to verify that you will remain eligible for the program. And what happens frequently because of these recertification periods is people get dropped from the program because they're not fulfilling their obligation to recertify for a variety of reasons. And when they're dropped from the program, bad things happen. One of the bad things that happens is, of course, an individual who is eligible for food and the children in that home are not going to receive it. And we don't want to see that, of course. The second thing that happens from an administrative standpoint is you now have to have an individual reapply, which takes a lot more time on the part of the agency. So it's really expensive for both sides for people to get dropped from the rolls. It's called churn. So people get dropped from the rolls. They didn't want to get dropped from the rolls. So so they reapply. This takes them longer. It takes the agency longer. It becomes very expensive. So we said, okay, let's try a very simple innovation. The USDA financed a large program. We just found out today that this is going to be, has been accepted for publication in a peer-reviewed journal, where we created a texting program for them. And we started to text recipients, our people on the program, rather than mailing that. They actually get about, believe it or not, 7 or 8 letters through the mail, which isn't terribly effective either, both, well, for lots of reasons, including financial, from a financial perspective. So we said, look, you got to stop all these mailings. Let's just start texting them. There's specific language in the text. This is the way that we would like to try it. We were able to improve the number of people who recertify on time by, depending on the group, up to 15%. So that was a very, very dramatic improvement, again, through a texting program that was actually the same cost as what they were doing. What they were doing is using a robocaller. So you're right. So we're all familiar with that. The phone rings and a recording comes on, and the recording was saying you have your recertification period is you need to recertify for SNAP, or you're going to lose your benefits. Please take care of this in the following way. The journal editor and I were speaking this morning, and he actually told me a story. His wife works in the nonprofit industry, and he was saying, oh, this is a pretty interesting study. They're talking about ways to get people to recertify for SNAP, and they were calling, and she said, oh, no, you can't call, you have to text now. And he's like, that's exactly what they did. It made a huge improvement. Very inexpensive. And then the final slide I want to mention is, we don't always come up with the interventions ourselves. These are programs that we've completed. We actually worked with the Glimmerglass Festival, which is an opera in Cooperstown, New York. They created a podcast to improve diversity, inclusion, information, conversation within the arts. And they made this pretty innovative podcast, but they weren't sure whether this podcast was being effective at all with respect to improving people's thinking about diversity, inclusion in the arts. So we came up with a way to randomly use an RCT, a randomized controlled trial, to determine whether their podcast was effective. And what we did was we took a bunch of very successful and very popular podcasts that were addressing the topic, and we compared their intervention or their podcast to the other group, the one that was popular. And what we found was actually theirs was being more effective than all but one of the podcasts that were out there, which was really helpful for them. A couple of quick things that we have in the field right now. Before I come to a close here, we're doing a program in Onondaga County, again, the county where Syracuse is, where we're going to start informing WIC recipients. WIC is a program for our young mothers and their children. A lot of individuals drop off the program before their eligibility expires, usually after their child's within a year. So we're going to start creating a program where we tell them, this is how many benefits you have left that you're not using. We're duplicating some of this tax and water bill project in Shreveport, Louisiana. We're very excited about that. We've been working with a group in Norfolk, Virginia. We've put in some grants to investigate their public housing, which they're renovating for a variety of reasons, including that they're having lots of flooding in some of their public housing. So how does one recreate a message and create a program where you can move people around in the public housing without disrupting their lives so much? We're doing some career coaching through a community college locally. We're working with a partner in Costa Rica where we're going to, they have the intervention. We're going to test whether a conditional cash transfer program is effective. This is going to be run throughout the nation. A conditional cash transfer means that they're going to pay people to go to school. So low-income families where children are often needed to go into the labor force, right, to go into to work on the farms or the fields. What they're going to do is they're going to pay families what is about 15% of their annual income to increase so for the child to go to school and not to start working. So they think that might be effective. We're also doing an intervention across the state of New York where we are going to test whether different opioid treatments for individuals who have been convicted of an opioid crime or an opioid related crime are effective. We're going to run a bunch of trials across the state of New York. A lot of this is behavioral, human-centered design programs. And we're curious to see, are these different locations that are trying different things? What is successful? What is not successful? A lot of behavioral science is about nudging these small things. We talked about texting. A lot of behavioral science is also about trying to get people with very bigger issues, dieting, exercise. How do you get people to do things like that? I want to say in closing a couple of things. One is Kathleen Walters, the chair of the Board of Trustees of Syracuse University, has been an amazing supporter of the Maxwell X Lab. I think the idea of bringing scholarship into the community and trying to do good has been is really resonates, I think, with a lot of certainly with Ms. Walters, with David Van Slyke, our dean, who's been amazingly supportive of the lab. And so what we can do largely through the generosity of Ms. Walters is we actually pay for a lot of these innovations. So a place like Shreveport, Louisiana, where they don't have discretionary money to hire the lab, as inexpensive as it is, they just don't have those lines in their budget, so we can pay for that. Syracuse, New York, we've done some work in St. Paul that I didn't mention that we used Walter's monies to actually run. The second thing and the last thing that I'll say is it's important not only that we're helping in the community, but that we're developing our own students to be successful, to understand the importance of running experiments, to understand the importance of working in the community, to really give them a skill set that makes them marketable. So we have both undergraduates, we have master's students, and we even periodically have doctoral students who come to work in the lab as research assistants that provide all sorts of different support for us. Again, that goes from providing the research to writing up some of the research to helping us with our data. It's just been a tremendous experience. The demand is incredibly high to come and work in the lab. And I have to say, our students at Syracuse, I'm inspired every time I work with them to see the level of interest, the curiosity, the intelligence, the work ethic. We bring in probably 2 or 3 every year, and I have to say we usually have 30 to 40 who apply. We are always amazed at the young men and women who are coming to the university and spending some time with us. I would say this is partly an initiative from The Source, which is an internal unit here at the university that helps pay for interns, as well as, again, Ms. Walters, who has been a real champion for us. So I'll stop there. And I'd be delighted to talk about any parts of the X Lab or anything else that would be of interest.
Len, thanks very much. So yes, we're ready for the Q&A portion of our conversation today. If you have a question for Professor Lopoo, you can raise your hand using the participants tab at the bottom of your screen. Raise your virtual hand, or you can type it in the chat box using the chat icon at the bottom of the screen, and we will ask it for you. Okay, we have one person with their hand up in the participants list. David, Please unmute your microphone and you can ask your question directly.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Professor Lopoo. It's great to see you.
David, how are you?
I'm great. How are you doing?
Good.
So I have a couple of questions, which I'll try to keep brief. The first one being, I think actually it would have been the year that I went to APAM with while you were presenting. We've seen this evidence about improving the design of forms. IRS has done it, GSA has done, like lots of people have done this. And so I'm curious about like how much more experimental evidence you think we need in order to understand that like if we designed government forms better, people would actually do what we want them to do. And so then maybe you should consider unleashing a fleet of UX designers on the state and local sector. And then the second question is looking at some of the work by Pamela Hurd and Donald Moynihan on administrative burden, right? Part of the reason there's lots of churn in SNAP is because it's designed that way deliberately. And so I wonder how you think about, policy problems that might be better solved upstream of people that are implementing, at the level of that churn. So thank you very much.
Great questions. It's great to hear from you. Your picture from APAM still cycles on that website, so I actually see you fairly regularly. I don't know if you knew that. So with respect to your first question on forms, I think there's a few things to say. One is Angus Deaton is a Nobel Prize winner, just wrote a really nice paper, and he lays out some of the criticisms of using experiments in some social science. And one of the things that he said is context matters. That we can't assume that because it worked in Syracuse, New York, it will work somewhere else. So what I would say is this: usually you're absolutely right. The low-hanging fruit is the first time we try to innovate, whether it's a form or a text message or a letter or whatever it is that we do. Usually we can make a big bump because what's actually being employed at the time has some noticeable gaps. Once people recognize some of those things, and I don't think it's commonplace at this point in the public administration sector, but I think there will come a time when people will recognize, oh, you can't do this, or people don't respond very well, or you should do this and people will respond well. So we're not there. So I'd say hopefully we'll get there one day, but I don't believe that we are there yet. And then we A/B test. So sometimes we'll make a change, we'll see a big bump. And then because this is so easy, again, sometimes it's a matter of 3 or 4 weeks. We can just keep changing the messages and bump and bump and bump because the cost is so low until we finally reach a place where any other intervention, we don't see a lot of improvement. So I would say because it's so inexpensive, and the return is so great, I think we've got a long way to go. I don't think we've reached the saturation point that you said. The second thing that you asked about, administrative burden, which is a great question. It's actually interesting because the paper that I mentioned we're getting published that we found out about today is actually about administrative burden. And we do talk a little bit about how it is strategic sometimes for the public administrator to create burden, to slow down, let's say, intake rates, or to create hurdles to make sure that for a variety of reasons that I think Hurd and Moynihan talk about. But that's not universal. I don't think that that's completely true. And it's certainly the case of Hennepin County. They want more. They were trying to understand, why aren't we getting the kinds of rates that we're getting? And again, in the case of Hennepin, this was costly to them. So it really was a matter of, we can make our lives easier and we can save a lot of money if we can become more efficient. So I recognize what you're saying, but I would say that's certainly not universal. And thank you for your questions, and it is great to hear from you.
Len, we've got a few questions in the chat box and a couple people with their hands up. So let's see, Maria is asking, do you have capabilities to work internationally? Do you partner, or are you interested in partnering with international NGOs?
Yes, 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 please. I mean, when Joe, I showed the picture of Joe. Joe is my co-founder. When we started, Joe's from Syracuse, and we sort of said, our starting point needs to be Syracuse. There's certainly a lot of areas here that could use our help, and it's close, and it's going to be easier, I think, to develop the relationships that we need in Syracuse. I'm actually from Louisiana originally, and it was important for us to make some connections there too. But I think as we have grown, we have become more and more interested and recognize the need to expand I mentioned Costa Rica. We have been engaged with them for quite some time now. We're doing an initial project, but we've just received their data. And I mentioned the conditional cash transfer, which will go throughout the country. We've had some conversations with some potential partners in India. So yes, please, absolutely, we would love to do that. Yeah, I can make sure you can get my email or
Maria, we can post some things in the chat box, and you can get in touch with me, my team, or Professor Lopoo directly. We'd love to make these connections.
One of the nice things about having such a strange last name, it's really not hard to find me on the web. So please send me an email. I'd love to talk.
Great. Thanks, Len. Nancy Andre has her hand up. Nancy, unmute your microphone and please ask your question.
Yeah, hi, Professor Lopoo. This is Nancy Andrade. I'm a 2011 MPA alum, and I work with you on my capstone project. Thanks for your great presentation today. I actually work for CDC, and I appreciated your public health examples. So I was just wondering, in the projects that you've done, have you all seen any instances where what elected officials have said or done have had an impact on behavior? So I'm asking that because we're seeing now in the pandemic, even though we have the data and the best available evidence right now to back up wearing like cloth face coverings, for example, because of what elected officials have said, some people are less willing to do that. And as public administrators, public health folks, even though we have the data and the information, we can't really change what our public officials are saying or doing. So just wanted to see if you all had seen that in any of the projects you had done.
Thank you very much for your question, Nancy. It's great to hear from you too. I was going to tell Scott that anyone I had taught should get priority in the list, but I didn't. So maybe it's nice to hear from some former students asking questions. So to get back to what you're asking, Nancy, I mean, the hard part, of course, would be, you're right. That's not something, when we run these experiments, we sort of set it up so that we have a starting point. We can measure things before, we can measure things after and see changes. As different messages are going out, unexpectedly at a different time, it becomes very difficult to know how important that particular message is or set of messages are to the behaviors of individuals. What we have talked a lot about in the lab, and would be, again, often when we need a partner, right? So what we've talked a lot about in the lab, we can do this either with individuals or even online experiments. We can learn a lot of information, is just showing different messages, or potentially, as we did with the podcast, playing a video clip for some of the of people in our experiment of a particular political actor providing a message, or a set of political actors providing a message, and then experimenting on, is there a way to message that would counteract that or not counteract that or be more accurate? There's a lot, I think, experimentally that could be done to try to understand messaging. Again, it's a little bit, I mean, part of what happens is, we have all sorts of signs now on Syracuse University warning people about things and the importance of hand washing and space. And I think that that's terrific. And of course we should be doing that. But are there better messages? Could we have done this differently? Could we have experimented? I think lots of organizations have not thought so much about that. I think we should get those initial messages out. But we could and probably should spend some time thinking about what is effective. What is it that people really want to know? What are their concerns? How do we address that? So again, I think an area that's completely uncharted and ripe for a lot that we could learn to be helpful. So thank you very much for that question.
Thanks, Len. Ephraim has a hand up. Ephraim, please unmute your microphone and go ahead.
Hi, Professor Lopoo. My name is Ephraim Beiser. I'm a 2010 MPA alum. I love seeing this work. I used to work at Code for America, so I've thought a lot about just the way these types of nudges, and specifically technology, make a difference. I also think a lot about my Professor Vince Lake's policy implementation course a lot in my world. And my question is, I love that you got a journal article That's great, but bureaucrats who run SNAP programs don't read journals. And we don't have, I'm glad we did this. I think this is a good thing that's happened, but there are so many more places that need this. I can think about, even with the tax work, how many cities and their budgets have been upended. And if there was money that they could have otherwise been receiving that they wouldn't get because they don't have those systems in place, that's a major issue. So, and I think about how so much of this actually gets delivered by a series of vendors that government pays to do something for them. So how do we scale these interventions fast enough so that more governments, because we have such a federated system, actually take this approach to not only better serve the public, but to also in some cases ease their burden and collect the revenues that they need.
Again, I love that. I've thought about some of the, I didn't know if there would be questions. I wrote up some questions to ask myself in the event that there were none, and you all are hitting a bunch of them. This is high on my list, so thank you, Ephraim. I think there's a couple of things here I would highlight. The first is the journal. You sound like a lot of my team here. So mostly what we do is we write short reports. We've got on our website, again, please write to me, I can connect you, but if you just type in XLab, you can find our website. We have a list of all of the projects that we've completed, which is well beyond, I think we're probably at 30 or 40 now, than the number that I've listed. They're 2-pagers. And we try very hard to circulate that periodically, which is strange for an academic. We actually try to get into some of the media. I showed you the piece from Syracuse that was in over 100 papers. We do try to promote some of this. It is difficult. You're absolutely right. There's 2 things I think that are fighting against a lot of these ideas that you touched on. One for certain, that is the vendor. We're trying to. All I'm really ever doing with the XLab is either we use, again, Ms. Walters, who has been so generous, we use our own internal funds, or some of the cities we work with actually have fairly, have a nice budget to try to innovate and can pay for these things. But we're competing with vendors. So when we're charging $5,000 or $10,000 to run these things, we think this is an amazing deal. But vendors have these PR machines and these networks and these people who are trying to continue to sell their product, most of the time not evaluating it at all. And I think there's some confusion on the part of the public administration side. What should we use? What shouldn't we use? How complicated is this? So I think that's right. This is a space that's crowded, and part of what's so difficult, I've got a doctoral student right now who's writing on this. Why is it so difficult for public administrators to try these trials? Because I'll be very honest with you, probably 80% of the conversations that we have with individuals don't go far. Because as soon as we start to talk about the importance of the trial or how we're going to get evidence that's effective, they don't like that. They'd much prefer to have someone at the end of this as an evaluation say, hey, did we do a good job? Right? Ask someone, yes or no, we did a good job. Yes. Okay. That's our evaluation. That doesn't mean that it was effective. Doesn't mean it was effective 6 months later. We're going to actually find out 6 months later, a year later, did your thing work? And honestly, I'm not sure all public administrators want to know that. So we do have these, it is very, very difficult. But we have lots of what we have found, and I've been inspired by, are the public administrators who are out there who really want to innovate, who want to know if it works, who want to, to make things better. There's so many of them. So it is a delicate dance. I'm not sure if I answered your question completely, but I do think it is difficult. When we start to talk about, we're going to randomize, that means some people aren't going to receive this for a little while. In the medical community, somebody's going to die. No one questions that. In the social service delivery, we say, oh, you're not going to get this benefit for 3 months. Often we get shut down at that point. And I think part of that is a mindset. And that's why I do think, going back to Nancy, the health industry is really far ahead of us. And I think maybe part of that is Maxwell and other schools. We should be emphasizing this maybe more. I know my students out there know I've been emphasizing it for quite some time. Did I answer your question, Ephraim?
Kind of.
All right. You want to try
think,
again?
well, no, but no, I think you're getting at something that's really hard. One, like there's just a lot of vendor inertia, and a lot of the vendors don't, you know, a lot of what I learned working at CFA was that we have to change. We need new vendors to get into it who can deliver on some of these practices, who are built with those user-centered principles. Something that, you know, that I think that is a challenge. But I think your point around the how do you scale this? It's hard. You know, there's thousands of government entities you need to get in front of. So, and like, how do you do it if you don't, you know, what's the vehicle? You know, it's Code of America for a while, was the fellowship with, are you actually building the technology that you want to scale, then become a product like that? I think those are the question is how we do that. So, no, but thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I do think when that first big study came out for the city, when you raised 1.5 million, when you secured 1.5 million in unpaid taxes, that went huge. That made national news. You turned a $5,000 investment into 1.5 million for the city. I think that got a lot of people's attention and got this really rolling in lots of different ways. We've got a range of questions coming in, Len, about some of these kinds of issues and some of the things you may have run into. So let's go there. Ann Stewart, good friend of and former colleague here at the Maxwell School, asks, does the public entity, the organization, give you data to analyze, or do you interview individuals to determine the outcomes? How does the data flow?
Both. So it is often the case that we can do this lots of ways. Some of the time we collect the data ourselves. It could be through an interview. It could just be administrative data that we work with the partner to collect. Sometimes it's anonymized, sometimes it's not. We can do all of that sort of ethically through our IRB. We also do some interviewing. Frequently what we will do is we will, to really, I mean, before we can innovate, we have to understand the process and the context extremely well. I mentioned the Hennepin County. We went to Hennepin County. A couple of, Colleen, I mentioned Professor Heflin, and Joe went to Minnesota for a few days and really learned the process and tried to meet the folks and understand what their capabilities were, what they were willing to do, what they weren't willing to do. It really varies each time. So the answer is yes, yes, yes. We sometimes collect our own data. We sometimes use their administrative data from the agency. Sometimes that's quantitative data. Sometimes that's qualitative data.
Great. Melissa is asking a very interesting question from South Florida. As COVID continues to cause economic disruption, the outstanding bills in her city's water billing department continue to grow. They have their lock-off process tied to the state eviction moratorium, which is set to expire in a few weeks. And they're looking for creative ways to get in touch with their customers with overdue balances at the time. Our case study documentation for the places you did the form changes and texts for the text to explain the technology and or the process that was used. Are you able to disseminate any of this in a way that might help them, Len?
Yes, great. As I said to Ephraim, I would encourage anyone to go to our website, and in a lot of those project briefs, again, just a couple of pages, we'll list some of the different things that we've done and why. And then the other thing I would say is I'm happy to send this to the individual who's asked. The nice thing about the journal article is we get about 30 pages. So we literally show this is the text that we use. This was the actual language that we used. And we're happy to share that with folks. This is not we're not trying to be profitable. It's a Syracuse University. What we're trying to do is help. We're trying to share. We're trying to use this scholarship and the things that we learn to make things better in South Florida and really everywhere else. So no, we're not trying to hide it. And we're happy to get any information that you'd like. So again, if you want to send me an email, if you don't find what you're looking for on our website, we can get that to her.
Great. Len, here's an interesting question. And if you, as you get into your answer, certainly feel free to change names if you need to protect anyone. But hello, Professor. 2 questions. This is from Jacqueline Buchanan. Have you had any potential partners who disagreed with your approach? If so, how did you secure their buy-in? Do you ever and number 2, do you ever pursue support projects that aren't randomized control trials for feasibility constraints, et cetera? Thank you.
Love the questions. So there are times when there isn't buy-in, and that's okay. I think related to the second question, so I guess I'll answer that too. We do actually use a lot of data analysis. I mean, again, my students know this. I've been doing what we would call natural experiments or data analysis for 20 years now. So not everything is an experiment in my career. I have probably, I have certainly much more time behind using data analysis of administrative data or other data sources. So we do a lot of that, particularly to try to understand the phenomenon better, right? We don't want to try to run an experiment where we don't understand who are you trying to reach. Which groups are probably going to be the most responsive to your intervention? Are there areas or places where our intervention was, could be worse, could make matters worse? So we do a lot of a data analysis before we do any of the experimental work. And yes, a lot of the time we will do, again, a natural experiment. So absolutely. The first question is really an interesting one. Yes, absolutely. There are times when people say, hey, I heard about you saving, Buffalo 250,000, or I heard about you saving, $70,000 for a $2,000 investment here. We'd like to do that. Can you tell us about it? So we'll go through it. And there are times when they say, oh no, we can't do that. And that's fine. We don't want anyone to do anything they're not comfortable with. But what's important for us is we don't want to put a stamp of approval on your program where we're not sure if it worked or not, right? Again, asking someone after the fact, was this effective? Or, I'll give you a conversation. I'll take the name off. We're working with a big group. It's a really huge program. And honestly, the individual said in the meeting with the evaluators, I don't really need you. I know this works. Why? But they had to have an evaluator. Again, it was a huge project. So we really don't need you. And I said to the individual, this was a year ago, I said, what's going to happen if the economy collapses? This is a jobs training program. If the economy collapses or the economy goes through the roof, I guess they might like that. But if the economy collapses, you need us to say the reason you're not able to place people in your job training isn't because your job training program is ineffective, but because the economy collapsed. Right? So evaluation is crucial, I would say. So yes, there's often times when we have conversations and people say, yeah, we're not interested, or yeah, we just need, what we translate into, we just need your stamp of approval. Well, we're not interested in doing that. We have people we can help. It is the case frequently where people will say, yes, this sounds great, we're all in. And then we start to, get into the nitty-gritty details. Yes, we're all in. And then at some point something happens and they start to pull back. Well, wait a minute, you mean that we can't do this anymore? I was like, well, we agree that you were not going to provide this service for, this period of time for this group. Well, we can't do that. And so people will pull out at that point, which is frustrating, of course, for everyone, but we don't want anyone to do anything they're not comfortable with. So, I mean, to answer the question, I know I need to get shorter here, Scott. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I'm kind of passionate about this. I guess people can see. So yes, it happens, and it's really okay. I mean, we understand this is part of the process. And I'll say this as well. Sometimes everyone is all on board. We're ready to go out, and counsel's office gets what it is that we're going to do and just says no. And we'll try to, frequently we can get over that, but often it's a no and there's no explanation. It's just we're not comfortable, or this is just a no because we don't think this is acceptable. And so yes, we frequently get stopped.
So we have about 5 minutes left. We may steal an extra couple minutes if we could. We have two final questions and then we can call it, I'd say, Len. Okay. Andrea Webster, 2012 MPA grad, former student of yours, asks, have you or are you interested in evaluating projects that end up as key performance indicators for local governments? I work with local governments that manage climate action plans, and it's really hard to identify performance metrics for the climate project goals. And it's hard specifically because the evaluation that is needed requires collecting scientific data, which requires a capital outlay. Have you partnered with other scholars to try to identify successful metrics in this area?
Yeah, this is a great question. I love it. Part of the most, there's a lot that's fun about this, but one of the most fun things is, you have to be very clever. There's not a recipe most of the time. So you do have to think a lot about what works, what won't work, what's feasible, what's not feasible. We have been doing some work. We've put in several grants that I'm thinking of right now that involve a lot of science. For example, Becky Shuey, who's a sociologist here, we put in an SF grant on nuisance flooding, which involves a lot of scientific components as well as some behavioral components. So I think the answer is yes. I think there are complications that you have to think through, and I think that's why partners are so important and why Syracuse is often a good partner, because if we need a scientist, we can frequently find that individual on campus, or that we can place kind of the social scientist to your scientists, and allow you to maybe collectively just to reach places that you couldn't otherwise. So again, I love the idea and would be very happy to speak more about it, and love hearing from former students.
Great. David has his hand up. We'll go back to David. David, unmute your microphone and ask your question.
Sure. Because I figured.
Video now. Nice.
Yeah, I put on a real shirt and everything.
Oh.
So I think my final question is about, I'd be interested to hear your reflections on interdisciplinary decision making. So one of the things that's been interesting about the way the pandemic has unfolded is that I think we've actually done a pretty terrible job about this. And so like a place where you can think about there being really significant tension there right now is medical ethicists are saying it's totally unethical to do like accelerated vaccine trials where you would put people at risk because you might kill them, even if you have people who have volunteered who might be different from the population, right? But like, so on the one hand, that's kind of a standard medical ethical way of reasoning. On the other hand, like the inavailability of this vaccine is going to be globally devastating. And it doesn't seem to me that anybody has really come up with a good way to think about how to balance those two things. And so if you're thinking about making decisions where these disciplines might have conflicting values, how do you go about squaring that circle?
Well, I think your question is a really good one. I would suggest, again, maybe checking out Professor Deaton's piece. It just came out of an NBR working paper, I think last week. He talks a little bit about the ethics of running some experiments. I would say you put your finger on a very thorny issue. I will declare sort of where I stand on this piece, but I certainly will recognize that different people can have very different opinions, and certainly they're all valid, and I certainly have respect for other options here. The thing that scares me the most, quite frankly, David, about this is I understand. I mean, so you sort of took the gray example, right? One example might be we should run experiments to understand which vaccine works. The polar opposite of that isn't rushing it. The polar opposite of that is start administering medications to people without any sort of medical intervention. Clearly, I'm not comfortable with that. I do think that I have very strong concerns, and I would say this is not just in medicine, it's working with poverty reduction programs, right? I have honest concerns that some of the things that we may have done historically could potentially have made our poverty issues dramatically worse than they would have been otherwise. I think that there are resources that we are putting into certain interventions that could be 3 times more effective in a secondary or sorry, a different intervention. We just don't know that. So I certainly understand and appreciate the need to rush. What I'm more concerned about is something like a thalidomide, right? Where you run these very quick experiments, you think that this is going to work and you don't really do a thorough job. And then several years later, we realize this vaccine that we've now given to every human being on the planet is actually going to have these implications, which may make the pandemic seem trivial in comparison, right? You can imagine some extreme scenarios. So I really am a big believer in the experiment and patience, and I understand the political pressures and the demands from people, but this is, you know, one of those wicked problems, one of those very, very difficult issues. And I don't know why or when all of a sudden we expect government to be able to solve some of these problems very, very rapidly. I am a big believer in taking your time, not too much time, but to do it thoroughly. I really do think we could potentially make matters much worse, and that gives me great concern.
Len, thank you so much. If I could ask one final question, if this is okay, I think our guests would be delighted to hear about the new class you're creating and going to teach at Maxwell in the fall. I think that'd be interesting. Could you give them a little snippet as to what you're going to be doing with our students in the fall?
Sure, great. Yeah, thank you for asking, Scott. So those of you who are from the MPA program, or at least familiar with the MPA program, we have just started a data analytics program. This is our second year. And one component of that has been to move the field and the people who come here to become more trained in data analytics and machine learning, so that we can take some of the massive amounts of data that we might have in a federal agency or even a state agency, and start to use those data analytics to figure out how we can become more successful. A couple of examples of the types of things that are relevant here, right? One thing comes to mind, I think in Chicago, they use some of this material, these data analytics strategies, machine learning, to make predictions where the water mains are most likely to break next, right? This is important. You have a limited amount of resources. You don't want to just kind of randomly change your infrastructure or wait for your infrastructure to fail. If you can use some very sophisticated modeling and data analytics to predict where things are most likely to fail, you can place your resources there. Again, it's about efficiency, because government, we have massive amounts of data. So I'm starting a machine learning class. We're going to start it, I guess, in a couple of weeks. I'm really looking forward to it. I think that this is the wave of the future. This is where we're going, and it's nice to see Maxwell staying on the cutting edge. So yeah, thanks for asking about it, Scott.
Len, thank you so much. Thanks for doing this today. As we all know, the Maxwell School is and has for nearly every year been the #1 school in public administration, ranked by US News. So our faculty and you are a huge part of that. So thank you for the work that you do. Thank you for innovating and for bringing that to our students and to our alums. I'd like to thank Jess Murray for organizing today's event, and for all of you for joining us. I would encourage you to stay in touch with us, watch your email, look for future programs. If you have ideas or topics you'd like us to explore, please email us at alum@maxwell.syr.edu. Let us know what you'd like to see, and we will put the program together. Len, thanks so much, and thank you all for joining us today. Take care, be well.